We are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Fatima Bhutto. Fatima Bhutto is an Afghan-born Pakistani poet and writer. She studied at Columbia University and the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Her work has appeared in The Daily Beast, New Statesman, and other publications. And she is the author of a couple books, Whispers of the Desert, and here to talk about her new book, Songs of Blood and Sword, A Daughter's Memoir. Start out and tell us, what was your motivation in writing your book, Songs of Blood and Sword?
Well, there were several, I suppose, but really, I come from a country, Pakistan, where violence is part of the political ethic of the country. We are a young country, 63 years young, but we've seen countless assassinations, whether they're of public figures or whether they're of ordinary Pakistanis, journalists or activists. And part of what seems to accompany that violence is silence. We are expected to bear it and to be quiet about it. And it was important for me to break that silence, especially as my family has witnessed so much of that violence very closely. And, it was also a way of, I suppose, seeking justice, but justice through memory rather than anything else.
Talk a second about the silence. Is that something that's just culturally unique to Pakistan?
I don't think so. If we look at the region, we know that all across South Asia, whether it's India or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, we have these things in common. We have, first of all, a history of dynasty. In all these countries, we're all former colonial countries. And then there is that violence that also seems to follow the pattern in all these countries. Again, whether it's the assassination of the Bandu Naikas in Sri Lanka or the Gandhis in India. It also would follow then that you have journalists being killed in Sri Lanka, that it's not allowed to talk about. There is basically a civil war going on in parts of India and Chhattisgarh, for example, over resources. And it's not acceptable to discuss the violence that follows that war. And in Pakistan, we have violence that changes form so often, whether it's the political assassinations or the deaths from these drone flights or just extrajudicial killings, which we have an unfortunate history of. There seems to be an amnesia that follows all this violence that makes it possible for it to continue. So
let's talk a bit about your family. Your grandfather, I believe, was very influential. Talk a bit about him.
Yes, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was the first democratically elected head of state of Pakistan, and it was under his government that the first constitution was written. That you had Pakistan move away from its traditional role as a client state, which it had been for some 30 years at that point, to engaging in a more bilateral foreign policy. You had the last land reforms carried out under his government, though they were not to be continued, and Pakistan remains a very feudal, very centralized country till today. But he was really part of something different. I think he was part of a different imagination for Pakistan. And that's not to say that he was without his mistakes. He certainly made very fatal mistakes, but it was a different period in our country's history.
And Pakistan at that time had a Congress, or parliament? Or?
It did. And, it was a country really in flux. It had only been created 30 years prior. Pakistan was further wrenched apart. In 1970-71 with the creation of Bangladesh. So it's been a country constantly forming. But that was really the first time that you had people go out to vote in a popular election. Before that, you had appointed prime ministers and selected prime ministers, but not popularly elected ones.
And who were they appointed by?
Oh, well, it depends, I suppose. The army, the founder of the nation did a bit of appointing. But, I suppose we return back to that in a way. We don't call them elections in Pakistan. We call them selections nowadays. Because when we're fortunate enough to have them, it seems that the results are already predetermined.
Something I think we're importing here in the U.S. So what happened to your grandfather?
Well, he was overthrown in a coup d'etat in 1977. And, he had isolated himself politically. He had begun to expand his powers at the cost of the constitution, which was a grave mistake. He had, like all other rulers before him, and all others that would follow after him, he'd used force in the oil-rich province of Balochistan. And perhaps most destructively, he had promoted the man who would kill him. He had promoted an army general over the heads of more deserving generals because he felt he would be a pliable man. And it was that man, General Zia-ul-Haq, who launched a coup d'etat in 1977, and then 2 years later executed my grandfather.
All right, and that probably synchronizes with about when I became conscious of Pakistan was General Zia.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
It was also an incredible time, I think, for the region. In 1979, you had the Iranian Revolution. You had Afghanistan, the Russians in Afghanistan. You had great violence in Pakistan, and Pakistan becomes again, because it has been at various times, a frontline ally for America in the war against communism. And we're still really reeling from the effects of that relationship.
And how aware of the political turmoil and politics were you at that time?
Well, I was born 3 years after my grandfather was killed, and I was born in exile and grew up in exile. I was 11 when I finally returned to settle in Pakistan. So I was aware of the political side of the family because it had made me an exile, because it had taken me, it had taken my father away. And because there was this violence that followed almost, it felt like every decade. When I was 3 years old, my uncle, my father's youngest brother, was killed in 1985. And, you learn words as a child like assassination or like martial law that other children just didn't seem to know, I suppose.
So what was the circumstances that brought your father and you back to Pakistan?
Well, he had wanted to return for a very long time and was really stopped. But eventually he just decided that he was going to run for elections. And if he won, he was going to return. And he stood for a provincial seat in the Sindh Assembly and won. And I think he had spent at that point 16 years in exile. And those who have some experience with it know what an alienating and isolating experience it was. I just think he wanted to go home.
Did you find when you were growing up in exile what was that like?
Well, it's peculiar, isn't it? Because I grew up in a country that wasn't mine. That I felt in a way was mine. I lived there and I had friends, but I wasn't home. I mean, the language is different, the food is different. And so much of what I knew of Pakistan was told to me through my father's imagination. So it was a place he inhabited almost simultaneously. But in this quite romantic sort of dreamscape, it was always this other place that when we returned to, everything was going to be all right there.
And were you close with your father?
I was very close with my father, and I was a precocious little child that he had to deal with and give a lot of attention to. And also, I think, by virtue of the lives we lived, we were going to be close because it felt like we had each other and not much else. We were lost at sea for a long time. We were away from home. There'd been a lot of death in the family, a lot of violence. So I think we clung to each other in that period.
So I want to find out what happened. We were talking about your father, and you came back to Pakistan, and he was elected.
Yes, it was at the same time that his sister Benazir was also returned as prime minister for the second time of the country. But they had begun to differ very greatly as people. My aunt's first government was overthrown on grounds of gross corruption and human rights abuses in 1990. And when she returned to the office of the prime ministership in 1993, the corruption and the violence really goes into full throttle. And it's estimated, and again, it's estimated by the New York Times, by John Burns of the New York Times, that the first couple takes between $2 billion to $3 billion from the Pakistani treasury at that time. They're eventually tried in Switzerland for corruption. They're tried in the United Kingdom. They're tried across Pakistan. And Benazir is actually also implicated in the oil for food scandal, in giving money to Saddam Hussein's regime for oil contracts. So, this was a corruption that we lived with in Pakistan that, when you were there on the ground, you saw every day. And you saw it in the fact that there was no electricity in the summer months. And, you saw it in the fact that there was no sewage system. And when it would rain, the streets would be filled with water. And my father was very critical, and he was very vocal about the corruption of his sister's government and certainly of the violence that was also a hallmark, especially of her second regime. And he was killed in 1996, 14 years ago, along with 6 other people outside our home.
And were you there at the time?
Yes, he was returning home from a public meeting he'd attended on the outskirts of Karachi. And as he was coming home, my mother and my brother and I were all inside the house waiting for him. His car was stopped, and there were 70 to 100 policemen on the roads that night. There were some in the trees and sniper positions. The streetlights had been shut. And 7 men were killed. And, 4 out of those 7 men were killed with single sniper shots, really to the head or the heart. My father and one other person were shot several times, but killed by execution shots fired at a point-blank range. And after the shooting was done, all 7 men were left to bleed on the roads. They were left to bleed to death for about an hour before they were moved. And when they were moved, they were all moved to different locations and none to emergency hospitals. And we were at home at the time. We heard the shooting. We were stopped from leaving our house by the police. And I suppose one has to back up a bit and tell your listeners that at the time that this happened, gunfire was not an unusual sound in Karachi. The Prime Minister had empowered the police force and the security agencies under a particularly violent operation called Operation Cleanup to, as it sounds, clean up Karachi. And it was directed at her opponents, at members of opposition parties, at activists, at community leaders. And at the time that Operation Cleanup was in effect, the year and a half or so it was in effect, some 3,000 men were murdered in the city I live in Karachi. So when we heard the gunfire, there was, it was sort of the symphony of the city at the time. It's what you heard. We would have had no reason really to expect that it was directed at us.
And yet it couldn't have been a good sound to people.
No, I don't think there's any way to describe the sound of gunfire, especially when it is so close. And at the time, like I said, I went to an American school in Karachi, and we would be going to classes and hear gunfire. Someone would shoot at the school, and we would have to stop and hit the ground and wait for the gunfire to stop before we carried on to our classes. So it was something that I think you began to adapt to, but that was still frightening. And the firing that night was so close that it didn't feel like those other times one heard gunfire, where it was sort of distant and far away. And it felt like it was being fired over our heads, which, it was actually.
And did they ever find out directly who had ordered this?
Well, my aunt's government, in the aftermath of the murder, had arrested actually all the witnesses and all the survivors of the assassination, and they were held in jail until her government fell without access to lawyers, while all the policemen who pulled the triggers were internally cleared and were returned to their beats, and they were promoted within the ranks of her political party, those who were members, and some of them were. And they were promoted doubly, triply, quadruply, and they remain in the Pakistani government till this day. But, one of the other things she did was that she stopped us from filing a police case, which was, and is, any citizen's right in the event of a grievance. And we had to go to the courts to get our rights returned to us. And again, we were stopped from filing criminal charges. And what my aunt did instead was she put in place a tribunal that was charged with investigating who was responsible for the murder. This tribunal had no legal authority to pass sentence or to issue verdicts, but ultimately they concluded that the order to assassinate my father Murtaza Bhutto could only have come from the highest level of government. And there was no one higher than my aunt at the time.
I mean, it's interesting because again, just growing up here in the U.S., I remember seeing footage of Benazir Bhutto on TV and being blown away. Oh my God, they have a woman prime minister.
Yes.
You know, and thinking how advanced that was at the time.
Well, you know, it's amazing because there was a different Benazir. There were many Benazirs, I think, and there was one Benazir that the rest of the world saw, who was this, you know, beautiful, brave woman. Who spoke English very well and you know, who sort of seemed like us or seemed to talk in a language everyone could understand. And she was, you know, people thought of her in very high regard. They saw her as a feminist and really as a trailblazer for democratic principles. But those of us who lived in Pakistan, you know, saw a very different side. This was also a prime minister who came to power 2 times, but never removed the Hudud ordinances, which are the most violent laws against women in the country. And they remain on the book and on the books. And what the Hudud ordinances say is that any woman found guilty of committing the crime of adultery, canon should be put to death. Any woman who engages in premarital intercourse, canon should be put to death. So to have a woman prime minister 2 times and for that law to remain is a great injustice. You know, it was also unfortunately during my aunt's last government that the Taliban in Afghanistan came to power, you know, supported and recognized by Pakistan. Pakistan was one of 3 countries in the world to recognize the Taliban. In 1996, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Benazir's Pakistan.
Now, did Pakistan, in addition to recognizing the Taliban, some say they had a very strong hand in creating the Taliban? Do you believe that?
Well, certainly if we go back to the 1980s and the last American adventure in Afghanistan, we know that the Pakistani military and intelligence services were the funnel for American arms and money to reach the Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen is, of course, now the Taliban. And I suppose when that adventure ended, those contacts didn't end. You know, there's no question that Pakistan was closely linked and did the CIA's bidding in Afghanistan throughout the 1980s. And you know, unfortunately for Afghanistan, it would seem that India and Pakistan both have played very dirty games in their countries since the 1980s.
Has the U.S. always played a significant role in Pakistan's history?
Well, that's a very good question. And in fact, the United States has supported every single military dictatorship that Pakistan has ever had. You know, we're, as we said earlier, 63 years young as a country, and we've had 4 military dictators. And they've all counted on financial assistance, military aid, and political support from the United States, which, you know, I think has been very telling for the Pakistani people.
When your father was killed, did you have to go into hiding then?
You know, my brother and I were sent out of the country because there were fears that that someone may try to hurt us, that if they were trying to remove the family, that we would be next. But you know, we went back to Damascus, Syria, where we had lived in exile for a month or 2, and then we came home. And it was important for us all really to remain in Pakistan. You know, it's too easy almost to go away, and in going away to erase what has happened or to allow it to be erased. So no, I live in Karachi now, and it's still home.
So what eventually became of Benazir Bhutto, for those that don't know?
Well, for those who don't know, she her second government was overthrown, again on grounds of gross corruption and more human rights abuses, and she herself went into self-imposed exile for several years and made the choice to return in 2007. She entered negotiations with General Pervez Musharraf, who was Pakistan's last dictator. They worked out basically a power-sharing agreement, and she returned to the country under a deal that had her corruption cases within the country shelved. And it was just 2 months after her return to the country that she too was assassinated in the city of Rawalpindi. In December, it will be 3 years that she was killed. And like all the other murders in the family and certainly in the country, there have been no answers. So Benazir was killed in December 2007, and no autopsy was carried out, so no one knows whether she died from a bomb explosion or from bullet wounds. No one has been arrested, no charges have been filed, and no cases have been opened. And this is unfortunately, this is a pattern that happens throughout Pakistan's history, no matter whose assassination you're looking at.
So who is currently president?
So the current president is Benazir's husband, Asif Zardari, who he's really, I think it's without exaggeration to say that he's one of the most powerful figures in the country. At the time of his wife's first government, he was given the nickname Mr. 10% because of his corruption. In the second government, he was upgraded to Mr. 50%, and now under his own government, he's Mr. 110%. He's not only known for the corruption, but at the time that he became president, he was standing trial in 4 murder cases involving the murders of 11 men. One of those cases was my father's murder case. And he was acquitted in the middle of those 4 ongoing murder trials to become president. And he became president in the same way that the dictator General Pervez Musharraf became president. He was selected by his own parliament. He didn't stand for elections or run from a constituency. And he's the man in charge of Pakistan today, yeah.
Do you have any aspirations for getting into politics?
No, none whatsoever. You know, I think growing up outside of power, one sees a very different side of it. One sees a very dark and very ugly side of power. And you know, I think Pakistan has to make a choice, really, what it wants. It has to choose whether it wants dynasty or it wants democracy, because you can't have both. They're completely incompatible because, you know, dynasty excludes, whereas democracy includes. Dynasty negates participation. Democracy seeks to further it. And, you know, we've seen these decades that we've suffered dynasty in Pakistan, that democratic institutions aren't strengthened. Progress isn't pushed forward by dynasty. And I would argue you've probably seen that around South Asia. You've probably seen it in Bangladesh too. You've seen it in India too, in Sri Lanka as well. Dynasty isn't a progressive form of government. It wasn't in the 1700s in Europe, and it isn't now.
Do you believe the U.S. government is supportive of the democratic process in Pakistan?
It would appear not, actually, because not only does America have a history of supporting every military dictator that Pakistan's ever had, but they've also propped up every corrupt and criminal civilian government that we've ever had. I'll give you an example. This government last year passed a law called the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act. And what this very odious act does is it provides jail sentences that range from 6 months for anyone of any nationality across Pakistan who has an email address that is not registered to their full legal name. If you are found under this law guilty of spoofing or satirizing or character assassinating the person of the president, that carries a jail sentence of anywhere between 3 years to 14 years. And just this summer, we saw upwards of 500 websites banned in Pakistan, including Google, Yahoo, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. Incredible censorship measures. And what we know is that in between these two extraordinary moves, the passing of the act and the banning of these websites, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton came to Pakistan on a visit, and she held a televised audience with members of the media in which she praised the Pakistani press for being so vibrant and so free. I can't imagine she believes that to be true, especially when we know even today there are journalists, I'm sure your listeners know the case of Umar Chima, who is a Pakistani journalist who was picked up, beaten and threatened with death for his very critical reporting, not just of the Pakistani army, but also of the corrupt civilian government. the New York Times has reported on Omar Chima's near disappearance and the violence inflicted towards him. So it's impossible that the American government doesn't know about it.
Talk a bit about how much power does the Army hold in terms of dictating things, and also talk about the ISI. Are they separate from the Army, and how much power do they hold?
Well, the army is a many-headed beast in Pakistan. It has phenomenal power, and its power isn't just political. And the political power it has is that the constitution of the country contains a clause called the Doctrine of Necessity. And what the Doctrine of Necessity says is that any time it is necessary, the army can intervene. Which is just completely absurd. And the army has taken full use of that doctrine in our 63 years of independence. So they're politically a tremendous force to contend with. They're also the seventh largest army in the world, seventh largest standing army in the world. So their size and their power is grand. And then financially, of course, the army is a sort of corporation in Pakistan. The army owns most of the land in the country. They own banks. Askari Bank is an army bank. They make cement. They make cereal. They make water. So they are omnipresent, one might say. And the ISI is a sort of cousin, I suppose. It's the inter-service intelligence, the intelligence services of Pakistan. And the ISI was greatly strengthened in the 1980s when it was the avenue for American money and guns to go through to Afghanistan. And it's peculiar, really, that they were empowered in such an unchecked way in the 1980s, and then somehow expected to hand back that power, which of course they've never done. They still remain very powerful in the country.
And do you believe they're pretty tight with the U.S. intelligence agencies?
It would certainly seem so. We've watched this government open Pakistani skies to unmanned predator drones that have flown over the country. It's the first time in our history we've allowed a foreign power to kill our own citizens. And the Pakistani military and intelligence seems to work hand in hand with America in allowing these drone flights, in providing intelligence, and in offering their citizens.
Talk more about that. It's just been in the last, the drone flights obviously have been going on for a while, but yeah. I know in the last month they've increased threefold at least.
Yes, we've had 25 drone attacks in the last 29 days. So September, which is the month after the most devastating natural disaster the country has ever seen, had more drone flights than any other month since they began. We know that in this month, in these 25 flights, one of which was yesterday, more than 150 people have been killed. And while it might be reported in the media, 9 terrorists killed, 9 militants killed, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be the case. Everyone who was killed in these drone flights is nameless. They are faceless, they are unindicted, and they are unconvicted. I've yet to see a name of somebody who was killed and the crimes they are guilty of. And certainly if they are guilty, then they should be apprehended and brought before the law. But to kill them in their sleep, that doesn't seem at all like a productive way to make Pakistan, or in fact America, safer countries.
Do you feel that these drone attacks are further turning Pakistani people against the United States?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we know that while the floods raged in Pakistan, and these are floods that I'm sure your listeners know have affected 20 million people in Pakistan. The United Nations says that these floods have been more devastating than the Haitian earthquake, the Asian tsunami, and the 2005 Pakistan earthquake combined. It's a scale of which we haven't seen before. And at the time that these floods were raging, America attacked with 2 Predator drone flights very early in the timeline of the floods. There were 3 drone flights within 24 hours of each other, some weeks later. And we've seen just a phenomenal amount of violence inflicted on a country that is reeling. What that says to Pakistani people is that when America talks about respecting human life in Pakistan, they don't mean it.
One can only imagine what that must be like, where you're expecting, the United States, portraying ourselves as the people with the white hats, stepping in to help, and instead we send in some drones.
Yes, and I think hopefully, Pakistanis are able to differentiate between the American people and the American government, as I hope Americans are able to distinguish between our government and our people. But a lot of hope was placed on the shoulders of Barack Obama, who Pakistanis had imagined would be different than the prior government that was not just violent, but illegal in many ways. And what we've seen is the opposite. We've seen the violent increase.
Talk a little bit more about the U.S. war in Afghanistan, how that is affecting the people of Pakistan. And do you and the Pakistani people see a real difference between that and the U.S. war on terror, or are they one and the same?
Well, most Pakistanis, I think it's fair to say, see this as an unjust war. And it's a source of shame that our country has been used to bring this kind of devastation to a neighboring country. I suppose we feel as many others watching the war would feel. It doesn't seem that the Taliban's power is diminished at all. It seems that once again America's chosen to back a corrupt and criminal government. Hamid Karzai is phenomenally corrupt. One wouldn't necessarily think of him as a great hope for progress in Afghanistan, but yet he's been the man in charge for the last 9 years, and there doesn't seem to be any sign of him moving aside for any real democratic participation in the country. And, certainly it doesn't look like the rights of women are much improved. There was this very odious law that was passed in Afghanistan, was it last year? That sounded certainly very Taliban-esque, even though it was being passed by a so-called democratic government. Pakistan has been brought in really to the war on terror. I mean, we've become the third front, although nobody seems to be talking about it that way. That is what it feels like and what it seems like on the ground in Pakistan.
And yet supposedly you're a U.S. ally to the war on terror.
Yes, which is very peculiar because we are not an equal ally, though. We're not equal partners. What sort of ally has its country bombed? In what has been daily missions? 700 Pakistani citizens were killed in drone attacks last year, in 2009, and more than 400 have been killed this year so far. I mean, the year is not even over. That's over 1,000 Pakistanis killed by our allies. We also know that the government in charge remains in charge because of American support. And your listeners, I'm sure, will be aware of the fact that a 5.5-minute video was just unearthed several days ago of what appears to be men in Pakistani military uniforms. They're equipped with standard issue G3 rifles, executing 6 plainclothed young men in the Swat Valley. We also know, according to human rights groups, that there have been 282 extrajudicial murders in the Swat Valley just this year. It's strange to me that this is acceptable behavior for an ally of a country that claims to represent human rights.
Now, do you see there in Pakistan, does the U.S. have its military within Pakistan? I mean, we know that the U.S. has CIA there.
Yes. CIA, and, there's all this talk of Blackwater and whatever their new name is, XE, their presence on the ground. And what is particularly telling is that as the floods were moving from north to south, and these are floods that have affected really, great portions of the country. They've gone from the northernmost point to the southernmost tip of Pakistan. A provincial health minister very exasperatedly said that it was impossible to get relief to a certain part of the country because an airbase on the Sindh and Balochistan border, the Jacobabad airbase, was being used by the American military for their drone flights. Now, as soon as this came out, the American embassy in Islamabad issued a very swift and excitable denial, saying that was in fact false and they are not using the airbase. But I'm not sure anyone particularly believes them in Pakistan.
Is that the only airbase the U.S. is involved in?
We don't know. I mean, it's the one historically they have used. It's a strategic base. It's just on the cusp of the very gas-rich Balochistan province, which also shares a border with Iran. So it makes sense that People suspect they're using it, but whether they are using other ones, we don't know. We don't have the right really to ask in Pakistan. And those journalists who do ask, for example, like Umar Chima, are very violently silenced.
You mentioned oil. Does Pakistan sit on top of oil reserves?
Oh, yes. Pakistan ought to be, and it is, I suppose, an incredibly rich country. We have gas, we have oil, we have coal, we have natural, minerals, and we have the land to grow the food we need to feed our people. But yet, millions are hungry, and this corruption is astounding. And I'll give you an example of how astounding it is. Pakistan missed its Millennium Goals to eradicate polio, not because we don't have the medical ability. Pakistan has gotten leprosy, for example, under WHO control limits, way ahead of schedule in the past. We have great medical communities in Pakistan that, in fact, are so good they travel around the world, serving other countries. But we were unable to eradicate polio because we couldn't refrigerate the vaccines. So this is a nuclear country that cannot provide even the most basic amount of electricity for the betterment of its people. That's the corruption in Pakistan, and that is why we are a rich country, a large country. We're also a country that has something like 60% of its population under the age of 30. But it's not empowered, that population. They're dispossessed. And certainly the corruption puts us in the position that we are now, that we are a country in need of great aid after our floods, and we have nothing to give.
So I know you said you're not interested in politics, but if you had influence on changing the situation in Pakistan, what would you do, at least in terms of like U.S. policy there? What changes?
I think unfortunately the money that goes from America to Pakistan is instrumental in propping up this corrupt and inept, criminally inept government. And if Americans knew where their tax dollars were going, I think they'd be less inclined to give it. The money that goes, for example, to the military, something like $2 billion a year goes to the Pakistani military. And again, this is the 7th largest army in the world. They are not particularly in need of money. More than 40% of the Pakistani budget goes towards the army. They're very well funded. The money that supposedly goes for development purposes in Pakistan never reaches the country. We've got this great problem of ghost schools that this government in its prior incarnations has been known to engender, where governments across the world, let's say from Scandinavia, will give money for schools to be set up in Pakistan, and maybe a shell of a building is constructed and a minister takes a photograph in front of the building, but no students are enrolled and no teachers are hired and no books are bought and no classroom equipment is ordered. So I would very much ask America to question where its money's going. It's not going to a place where transparency is the norm. It's going to a place of no accounting. And perhaps it should stop going.
And how are Pakistan's relations with the other countries in the region?
Well, that's a good question. They're suitably on edge with Afghanistan, certainly because Pakistan has been a base for the war on terror to be launched. When it comes to Iran, I think for the most part Pakistan has cordial relations, but there's no question that Iran sees Pakistan as an American puppet state. Pakistan used to have, and at various points in its history has had a very strong relationship with China, but that relationship seems to have been forsaken for America. And the relationship with India is as far as governments go, it's very precarious. However, I think Indians and Pakistanis share far more than what separates them. But our governments don't do a particularly good job of allowing us to connect as sibling countries that we are.
Here in the U.S., it's portrayed that Pakistan is extremely fragile, that it could break at any time, and the Islamic factions come running in. But isn't it because of U.S. operations and influence there that's causing that in the first place? Oh,
certainly. I think you hit the nail on the head. It's U.S. interference and it's corruption. Those are what make those things seem possible. But, as a young Pakistani, I have to say I hope we're very far from that kind of a scenario.
Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you for having me.